Hello and welcome to Across the Karman Line, a vodcast/podcast series where we talk about all things space. I'm Karina and I'm here with my co-hosts Aditya, Luca, and Pratyaksha. Today we have the respected Professor Dr. Zhao Yun. Professor Zhao Yun is the head of Department of Law at the University of Hong Kong. He received his PhD from Erasmus University Rotterdam, having previously received an LLM from Leiden University and an LLM and LLB from China University of Political Science and Law. The focus of Professor Zhao's research is on space commercialization and privatization, including the liberalization of telecommunication services within the World Trade Organization frameworks and national space legislation in China. We are delighted to have you join us for our podcast series, and we have a few questions for you to start with, and then we can build on from there. So our first question would be if you could just briefly talk about your educational background and your work in space law.
Yes, thank you very much. I think good morning, good afternoon, good evening. First of all, I would like to thank you very much for inviting me to this program. As you have very briefly introduced me, I think about my education background. I have my undergraduate studies and my first master degree in Beijing, the China University of Political Science and Law. And then I moved to Leiden University to get my second master degree in public international law. Afterwards, I moved to Rotterdam Erasmus University to get my doctoral degree in international law. So I think very simple and very straightforward. I think get all my degrees in international law, which can include international economic law, private international law, and public international law. When it comes to space law, I must say, I heard about space law when I was in the graduate studies in 1996, so more than 2 decades ago. My professor asked me, you should do some research in space law. I told her that I know nothing about space technology. So she replied, you don't really need to know so much about technology. You only need to know how to apply the knowledge of international law to space law. So I said, okay, I pick up some materials to read some articles, books on space law. So that's the start of my journey in the field of space law. Afterwards, when I joined Leiden University for master degree, I took one elective course in space law. So that's a really official time for me to know about space law, have a comprehensive understandings of the knowledge of space law. So afterwards, I realized I think a lot of legal issues are coming up, and I can continue the way of in my academic field in space law.
Okay, fantastic. You also partially answered our second question, which would have been what motivates you to stay on in this field. I guess after studying space law, what was your primary motivator? And you've been studying space law for years now. So what exactly is it that pushes you?
Yes, you're right. I think I have got some information from my professor in mainland China, but that's only very starting point. I just thought, okay, I can do something in space law field, but not so much interest at that time because I think space technology is simply too complicated for me. But after 1 year of study in Leiden University, I finished my master dissertation on the liberalization of telecommunications under the WTO framework. My master supervisor was very kind to recommend my thesis for a prize. And indeed, in the end, I won the prize, the Dr. Dietrich Westphal Prize, so that I got the chance to meet Professor Dietrich Westphal. She was a marvelous person at the age of 85 to 87 at that time already. So she took me to lunch and told me a lot of things about her career, her professional life, etc. So afterwards, I had the chance to regularly visit her home and spend Christmas in her home, etc. So I was really impressed by her personality, by her charm. So I think I can continue my way in the field of space law. So I think that's really something I think inspired me. I think I was totally inspired by her personality, and I think I can do something to continue her career. So I think that's a major part that I made my decision for my career in the next 2 decades.
Wow, that's so fantastic. So our third question would be, so you were the judge of the Manfred Lack Space Law Moot, which is actually the competition that Luke and I will be participating in this year. We just wanted to ask you, what was your experience like, and what do you look for in competitors?
Yeah, I think Manfred Lack's Space Law Moot Court, I think it's really a very great success. At international level, I had to participate several times, and once I also drafted the moot court problem for that year of competition. And of course, I think I sit as a judge for the semifinal, so I can see the performance of the students within the region, Asia Pacific region. I think India, I remember very well, very impressive performance. And in the Asia Pacific region, if we have 36 teams, then more than half can come from India. Of course, I think from mainland China, we have like 4 to 5, but Indian teams are so impressive. And I know the India team has already got to the final round, etc. So I think that's really, really good. And also, every year I sit as a judge for the Chinese round of Manfred Lack's Space Law Moot Court competition. So every year when I look at the performance of the Chinese students, my impression is that they are really improving. Every year I sit as a judge for one whole day, and then the second day I continue to sit as a judge for the final round, and then give 1 to 2 hours of talk with all the students to discuss about how to improve the performance, how a Chinese team can win in the regional round to beat the Indian team. So I think that's something, I think in the past, I think probably more than 10 years already, I think I can see the performance are improving. I think not only Chinese team, but also the teams from the Asia Pacific region. And also it's very competitive nowadays. I can see that in the early years, Singaporean team is the strongest. Then slowly we can see that Chinese team is picking up, and also of course Indian team is really performing very well. So I think that's something I can see. The moot court competition really can help the students to improve the advocacy, the performance in the debating, etc.
All right, thank you. So our fourth question is, what do you believe is the appropriate legal regime for space mining? So I read that this is something that you were writing about, and if you could just expand a little bit about it.
Legal regime for space mining is a hot issue, which requires urgent attention. The concept of common heritage of mankind was put in the Moon Agreement, but unfortunately, the Moon Agreement was not very well received. At the moment, we have 18 member states to the Moon Agreement, but no large spacefaring nations joined the Moon Agreement. I think the concept of common heritage of mankind is one major barrier. With the dilemmas going, so we can see that the United States has already taken the lead to make national legislation regarding how to make use of natural resources in outer space. The legislation was made in 2015. Then 2 years later, Luxembourg followed suit. So now we can see the unilateral approach that were adopted by these two countries. But my position is that unilateral approach is not ideal, is not appropriate. Indeed, by end of 2015, the International Institute of Space Law released a declaration questioning whether the unilateral approach is the ideal approach. So in my research, I mentioned that multilateral approach will be the best, and multilateral regime should be created for the space exploration and also the use of space resources. The example I also made in reference to the International Deep Sea Bed Authority, which was designed for the natural resources in the sea, law of sea. Of course, I know that the law of sea and space law are different. Space resources or space technologies are much more sensitive, which is very closely related to national security and national economy. But the reference to International Deep Sea Bed Authority will be useful. We can make some adaptations. So I think that will be a starting point to come up with a multilateral regime to deal with the space explorations of resources. The international society should work together to come up with this kind of regime. Of course, we will have to consider which country should take the lead or take the initiative. Probably China or Russia. I think these major countries, I think, should take the lead. Or probably the United States should reconsider the position whether they can take the lead to call upon expert group to come up with a regime. So I think that's something which we can take into consideration for the future development. But in the end, we really need to think about the balance of two types of interests. One type of interest is the interests of the investing companies. They should get benefits. They should have get the profits. If they have to share the profits among the international community, no private entity are willing to do so. So we, on the one hand, we have to take into consideration the interests of private entities or investors. On the other hand, we will also have to take into consideration the common interests of the international community as a whole. This has been put down in the Outer Space Treaty in 1967. So these two are competing interests. We will need to come up with a multilateral regime to balance these two types of interests. And for me, I think I'm quite confident and quite optimistic, because when it comes to the law of sea, the concept of common heritage of mankind has been put down in the Convention on the Law of Sea. And they were able to come up with a regime, come up with the International Deep Sea Bed Authority to deal with the exploration of resources in international deep sea bed. It should be able to work out within the area of space law. I think space field, I think we can be more creative. We should be able to have more cooperation in the field.
Why do you believe that within space law, the idea of common heritage of mankind is so controversial, and why it's been so difficult for international cooperation?
When it comes to the concept of a common heritage of mankind, that means all the countries should be able to benefit from the resources that they excavated from outer space. That means the investing companies, the investors, put in a lot of money or resources in the space exploratory activities. But in the end, when they get the profits will need to share amongst the international community.
Right.
So this is very, cause some kind of a difficulty for the spacefaring nations. I think these countries or these nations are most probably will be able to carry out space activities. So they have some hesitation in joining this kind of a treaty. And we will find out that how to reconcile the Outer Space Treaty and the Moon Agreement is a major problem at the current stage. Moreover, when we look at the treaties that were made during 1967 to 1979, all these treaties were made before the era of space commercialization. they could not deal with the new issues, or the existing 5 space treaties are not enough. There's a gap between the treaty and the space activities in the reality. So we will need to think about what can we do. On the one hand, we can still keep the Moon Agreement, and I have heard a lot of good words about the common heritage of mankind. They thought the term is so beautiful. We should keep the term in the space field. And indeed, many scholars argue that the common heritage of mankind, this term was first produced or created in a space field, is one of the unique contribution from the space world. So they would like to keep it. Now, what we should do is take a more pragmatic approach to realize the structure which can satisfy different type of interests.
All right, thank you. So moving on to our next question. Can you talk about the project on commercializing the International Space Station with particular reference to Hong Kong's future participation?
International Space Station is the most large international cooperative project in the space law field or space field. It is very successful. This project was done more than 10 years ago when I joined the City University of Hong Kong. I think at that time, I started to do research on the commercialization of the International Space Station. I had in mind Hong Kong's involvement in certain parts of the space experiments in view of Hong Kong's special status within China. I know I think it's rather difficult for China to be accepted into this major project, but I think Hong Kong is unique. So I think that's a possibility. So after researching on the liberalization of telecommunication services within the WTO, I believe that the space commercialization is a trend and Hong Kong should not be left behind. So the International Space Station provides an excellent platform for space commercialization. Since all the space treaties were concluded before the era of space commercialization, I believe that is need to examine possible ways to fill in the gap for regulatory regime of space commercialization. Hong Kong, with its special status and sound financial and technological regime or framework, would be best placed to be involved in certain aspects of the ISS operation. But of course, this did not come true. But on the other hand, we can find out that China's Tiangong National Space Station and Beidou navigation system are about to put into operation, I think, very soon. So my research could serve as a solid basis for Hong Kong's future involvement in the National Space Station, in conducting space experiments, how to commercialize space products, etc. So I believe the project that was done more than 15 years ago, I think will be quite meaningful now as it's the current stage. The Chinese government has announced several times regarding its open attitude. It said, okay, this belongs to a national space station. It's different from the international space station, but we are open. So every country are welcome to join certain parts of the space station. But of course, we do not know which part the other countries can join. But at least the position is quite open. And Hong Kong, of course, part of China. I'm sure that Hong Kong scientists or lawyers will be able to make contributions to part of the project. I still remember when I started to do research on the commercialization of the International Space Station, I looked into several interesting issues. One is regarding the liability issue, how to deal with liability. Of course, we have the 1975 Liability Convention, but there are some difficulties in applying the concepts such as a launching state, etc. So how to deal with a new development? That's one issue that I considered. But of course, I also look into the possibility of using the nuclear power sources. So I think all these are some issues I studied for that project. And all these issues, I'm sure that it will continue to apply now, which I think the most important part is intellectual property protection in outer space. So when the experiments were conducted in outer space, in the space station, how to protect these patents, or how to protect the copyright of remote sensing data. So I think there are quite a lot of issues which I'm sure will come into reality, and we will need to look at all these issues. And my project, I think, basically have done some preliminary research, which I hope I can further my research in this field.
All right. Thank you for the insight. So you are a member of the Institute of International Space Law. What sort of work do you do there?
One of the most important work that I've done is to draft a moot court problem for the moot court competition a few years ago. I think that was quite some experience for me. I did not expect to draft the problem. I know it's so difficult, it's time consuming. But they told me I think it's good to have an author from Asia Pacific region to draft the problem, because they have already authors from Europe, from the United States, from Australia, but never from mainland China, or from China, I must say. So I think that's the time when I agreed to take over the task. And I have been working very closely with the mooting committee of the institute. And I can see that serious attitudes in dealing with a moot court problem. I have gone through several rounds of revision, and also we have quite a lot of telephone calls to discuss how to improve the moot court questions. So I think that's quite some experience for me. But I still remember my first participation in the meetings of the Institute of Space Law. That was many years back, I think around 2002. When Professor Didrik Ho took me to the meeting, she said, also, please accompany me to the conference so that you will know more about space law. You will be able to meet more experts, space lawyers in the field. So I think that's something I think I still remember very well. She introduced me to the space law circle, and I have the chance to discuss relevant space issues with them.
All right. So we were just wondering, what inspired you to study in the Netherlands? You've done your PhD there as well. And is there something that you learned studying there as well? How was the experience?
Well, I think if I say something, I think very personal, I would say I think I'm a kind of person to like more peaceful environment. And I believe I think the Netherlands definitely was a nice place for me to stay to study. But I think to be more pragmatic, I must say I think the Netherlands is a hometown of international law. I have been taking international law studies in mainland China for 7 years, 4 years of undergraduate studies and 3 years of graduate studies. Then I think probably I should go further to improve my knowledge in specific areas of space international law. So Netherlands automatically came to my mind. So I think that's the first starting point. And my professor has been very kind to give me a lot of the information about Leiden University and also the Dutch government scholarship, financial support, etc. So I think that's really something I realized it is the first choice for me. Although I think at that time I'm also applying for study in the United States, I must say. But with all these offers, I think the Leiden University became the first choice for me. And I'm sure that for the international law, it's quite natural. I can go to the International Court of Justice, the Peace Palace to do research. I think that gave me a lot of opportunities, I think, to meet with jurists and also get sufficient documents for research, for study.
Understood. So what advice would you give to university students aiming to enter the same industry? And like what worked for you?
Uh, w- well, I think first of all, I must say, I think interest is in the field. I think is the most important. Space law is not a major field. I think it's a very small field. Even within the international law field, I think space law is a new branch of law within the public international law. So not many students or not many people knows about space law. In Hong Kong, when people talk with me, oh, you are doing research on space law. What is it? So I have to give them some knowledge. I basically give some examples. You are using mobile phone. Are you watching TV? I think all these involves a space technology, and we have to find a law to regulate these activities. So it's very important for the students to do some preliminary research and reading of relevant textbooks and articles to see whether they are really interested in the field or not. So with basic knowledge in the field, the students will be able to know whether you are interested and what can you do or what will you do. So I think these kind of questions they will have in mind before they really know what space law is. But now I must say you do not really need to focus only on space law. Uh, Space commercialization actually touches on many aspects of the legal subjects, including civil law, commercial law, intellectual property law, criminal law, etc. So I think very broad nowadays. So moreover, I think for the students, it's rather important to join or participate in some international conferences to get to know the academics and practitioners in the field so that they have some ideas about the needs of the society. They can do research, indeed, yes, but what the companies need so they can know something more. Through the participation in the international conferences, the students can also get updated with new developments in the field and probably settle down to research on specific legal issues. So if the students are determined to become an academic in the field, it will be useful to do a doctoral research, which can give the students sufficient time to get prepared for future academic life. If the students are more interested in practice, and indeed, I think there are more and more companies in the field. We can see the United States, we have the SpaceX, and also a lot of remote sensing companies and telecommunications companies. So I think more and more private companies are coming up. That's more areas, I think, fields for them to work on to get involved. I still remember, I think last year, when I was employed to be the kind of independent advisor to a company regarding the launching of satellite. I have a lot of discussion with them to see how many companies already in mainland China. They told me they simply more than 100, of course, big, small companies, they already in Beijing. So I can see that there will be a great future for the field. No, you can decide whether you would like continue to do research in space law or you can practice. Moreover, as I just said, space law is just one field. You can combine space law with civil law, commercial law. So I think now we can be more flexible.
Thank you for the advice. So moving on to our last question from me. Where do you see space law in the next 10 years and what excites you most about the future of it?
Mm. Well, I think it's good to speculate. I think always, I think when I was in the 1998, when I moved to Leiden, I did not know, I think, what it would be at that time. Uh, After 1 year of study in Leiden University, I was thinking probably I can continue doing my PhD, or probably, well, actually, of course, I also applied for positions in the international organizations and also positions in the United States, etc. So it's difficult to say, but I think, as I said, it's always good to think about what will be the future or what will be something look like in the next 10 years. International space law was created.
Sorry.
Yes, were made under the UN framework from 1967 to 1979 during the Cold War period. Space commercialization was not a major consideration at that time, or probably it has never been taken into consideration. But in the next 10 years, in view of the rapid development of space technologies, space commercialization and privatization will move ahead at even faster speed. So the existing space laws are not sufficient to cover all these new activities or to resolve all these new legal issues. So there's an urgent need to come up with rules to regulate these new legal issues. The United Nations has been the major platform for the lawmaking in making space law. But in the era of space commercialization, it might not be, the UN might not be the most appropriate lawmaking platform for space commercialization. So I think us international bodies should be involved, which can be the WTO, the UNIDROIT in Italy, or ICAO in Canada, Montreal. So it is so very exciting to see that more international bodies are involved. And of course, it's also exciting to see that more new legal issues are coming up, asking for solution. So for me, an academics, we can make contributions to the development of the new regulatory regime for the space activities, such as space sustainability, space tourism, and space traffic management, etc. So I think that definitely in the next 10 years, space commercialization and privatization will still be the major theme in the space field. And we can see, I think, a lot of new development has been made, in particular in the field of space tourism. So the United States, I think, is moving very fast. We will need to look into what kind of rules should be drafted to deal with the traffic. What kind of rules should be made to deal with the space tourists? What kind of rules can be made to deal with a space hotel, probably set up on the moon? So I think a very exciting, very new issues are coming up, and for me, I think I can always be busy with all these legal issues. But of course, I will be very happy to see more lawyers joining the team to work out some solutions for the new legal issues.
Thank you. So now members of our KCL Space podcast team and LAX Moot team have a few questions for you. So if you guys can just go around and ask any questions you have.
Sure, I'll go first. So just to follow up on the last question, like you spoke about how space commercialization has now become a thing, so laws are changing. So what kind of role does space law play in projects like colonizing Mars, etc.?
In the field of space, can you repeat the last part?
Yeah, so what kind of role does space law play in projects like colonizing Mars and going to the moon again, etc.?
Yes, I think that's something we look at. Of course, I think we are when we talk about the flying to the moon or flying to the Mars, you are not talking about the space tourism. So I think we can still look at the existing space treaties to regulate how to deal with the peaceful use of outer space. And all these activities should be carried out in the interest and benefit of the human mankind. So I think that's the first aspect to look at. But more and more, we are looking at the space sustainability. I think space sustainability is becoming more and more important because of the space debris. If we have more and more activities carried out in outer space, more spacecraft flying to the moon, to the Mars, so definitely they will produce more rubbish. and also the space debris. So I think this has something to do with the space sustainability. My view is that when we talk about the space sustainability, we will need to look at the horizontal aspects and also the vertical aspect. Vertical aspect is rather easy to understand. That means future generations still have the chance to use outer space, not only for our own generation. So I think that's a vertical aspect. When it comes to the horizontal aspect, I think that's even more important at the current stage. Outer space is not only open to spacefaring nations, it should also open to non-spacefaring nations. That means the spacefaring nations and non-spacefaring nations will have to work together. Only through this kind of collaboration will the spacefaring nations benefit, and also non-spacefaring nations gain the space capability and benefit from the space activities. Sometimes when we talk about this kind of horizontal aspects of space sustainability, it's rather difficult to realize because we have the kind of mindset saying that spacefaring nation can only collaborate or cooperate with spacefaring nations, that nothing to learn from the non-spacefaring nations. So now we will need to look at the non-spacefaring nations. How can they benefit from space activities? Of course, we are not expecting all the countries become the state which can launch the satellite, but we can bring the benefit to these countries. Of course, we say these countries are really enjoying their the new technologies. They have the mobile, etc. So that's one aspect. But we will see how they can also go to outer space, go to the Mars, go to the moon. So I think we'll probably the astronauts can be the first type of collaboration. So I remember the Iranian astronauts were also launched to International Space Station. Although Iran is not yet the spacefaring nation, but of course I think they are still moving up. I think now very quickly. So I think that's a very factual aspect. But when it comes to law, I think when we simply talk about the travels to the moon or the Mars, I think for scientific purpose, we can still rely on the existing space treaties, the 5 space treaties. Although we must say these treaties are made in a very, I would say, I think they are only principles. You can argue in different ways.
This question is about astronaut radiation exposure, which things like Mars would be exposing astronauts to very, very harmful, almost lethal and fatal amount of galactic cosmic radiation, which they cannot be protected against, even inside their spacecrafts. And the limit to which they're exposed to this is higher than the exposure limit we set for nuclear power plant workers as well. So, in your opinion on having laws made to safeguard astronauts in outer space, where do you think we should set the limit, and on what do you think we should base the laws that we make to govern the safety of astronauts working outside the protected belt of Earth, and which is not just the Earth but also beyond, like ISS also falls inside the magnetic sphere of Earth, which it protects the astronauts from a lot of radiations. So traveling to different planets, how would you think we should formulate laws on this?
Yes. First of all, I think we probably can look at the general rules in space law. I think that is the Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty, which deals with the environmental issue and also involves harmful interference. I think so that could be one starting point to deal with the issue. Although this has not been discussed very well, I think in the previously, most of the discussions concentrate on the telecommunications law. So the International Telecommunications Union has regulations and rules regarding harmful interference. So this will be the most important part that we will need to look into. And third part, we will look at the specific areas of law. Here I mentioned about the international humanitarian law regarding the principles, basic principles of international humanitarian law, such as the principle of proportionality, the principle of distinction, etc., how to apply. And with these three types of laws, I just realized you also mentioned about the nuclear issue. So probably I would also like to mention about the use of nuclear power sources. We know that in 1992, the United Nations General Assembly has adopted a resolution regarding the nuclear power sources. But UNGA resolution is not binding, unfortunately. But these documents indeed give us some guidelines on how to make use of nuclear power sources in space activities. But as I said, it's not binding, which is disappointing. But on the other hand, we can find out that the discussions has already been carried out regarding whether we need to have a binding law on the use of nuclear power sources so that we can safely use all these sources and carry out a peaceful exploration of outer space.
Just pose one last question. This is on a very recent development. So last month, NASA solicited companies to extract lunar samples, which they would then subsequently buy. And I just wanted to ask, because there's this tension between, based on Article 2 and the principle of non-appropriation, and between the view of the United States and Russia potentially. And I just wanted to know your personal view on this, whether you think it's a positive development since it could encourage talks on space law.
Yeah, thank you for these very interesting questions. Indeed, I think this has something to do with Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty, I think the non-appropriation principle. But also, of course, this has something to do with the Moon Agreement, the common heritage of mankind. I think this is not something new or the first step that they took. The first step the American government has, or NASA has taken is the 2015 rules regarding the space exploration. As I very briefly mentioned, that in 2015, the NASA, of course, the American government has put down the new laws regarding the private entities' ability to explore outer space and bring back space resources for profits. Very soon after the issuance of the law, the international society has very heated discussions. I mentioned at that time, I said, we do not know whether this law is good or not. But I think my personal attitude or view is that the United States cannot wait for longer. The private entities are very eager to go to outer space to make profits from the space resources. So the American legislation really aroused heated discussions. So that means we have to move ahead very quickly without waiting idly, making no progress. So at that time, indeed, a lot of discussion has came out. International society have mixed views. As I said, 2 years later, Luxembourg indeed made national legislation. Similar rules were made. And the Chinese government also has some discussions whether the Chinese government should also make similar laws or not. But again, I think the Chinese government, so far, I think still takes the view that multilateral approach will be much better, will be beneficial to the international society as a whole. So that's why in the same year, in 2015, the International Institute of Space Law released a declaration. This declaration, first of all, mentions that this American law has not violated the existing international treaties. The United States has made it very clear that the new law or the government still respects its obligations under the international treaties. So there's no violation of international treaties. But the Institute cast doubts on whether this is a best approach. So I think that the institute only stopped there. It did not say anything whether we should continue or not. But very soon, the international society was able to move ahead. That's a Hague working group started to think about the space exploration of resources. So that's why I think it's good, but we can find out that not a lot of results has been achieved after 2015. So the United States, I think, took another step. The NASA allows the private entities or individuals really move forward. So I think this is another step to put the international society to seriously consider what we could do. If not, of course, we will move ahead and to see the response from the international society. But I still think the international collaboration is the most important. This principle has been put down in the UNGA resolution as early as 1958. Then, of course, this has been repeated several times and has been very elaborated in detail in 1996 UNGA. So we always believe that international cooperation is one part of customary international law. So that's why I think that it's good that the United States can push forward something, then the international society will make some response to say, make the society to think about what we should do, what will be the ideal situation for the international society to deal with the space resources.
All right, thank you so much. I think we'll have to wrap up for today.
Yeah.
But thank you for your time, Professor Zhao Yun. It's been such a pleasure speaking to you. And since we all are interested in space and space law, we hope that one day we too will be able to research into it and work within the space law industry. So once again, thank you for your time. And like I said, we've all learned so much. And it's just been amazing speaking to you.